I woke because my little sister, Runa, was shaking beside me. The storm was still hitting the walls, but the longhouse felt colder than it should have. When I looked toward the hearth, there was no flame, only dark ash. My father had asked me to keep the coals alive until morning, but sometime during the night, I had fallen asleep. I crossed the dirt floor and searched beneath the ash with a stick. The first pieces of charcoal were cold. Then, under one black piece, I found a faint red glow. It was the last heat left in the hearth. That morning, I had been proud when my father gave me the job. I did not yet understand how much of our life depended on those buried coals. Before I tell you how that day began, I am curious to know where you are watching from and what time it is there. You are welcome to share it in the comments. And if you would like to hear more about my family and our life in Hålogaland, a like or subscription would mean a great deal. Earlier that day, I had woken to the sound of Astrid coughing. Morning had already come over our small farm in Hålogaland, far in the north of Norway, but the longhouse was still almost dark. We had very few openings in the walls. A larger window would have brought in more light, but it would also have allowed more heat to escape. In winter, we needed warmth more than sunlight. Smoke hung beneath the roof and slowly moved lower. It made my eyes sting before I had even left the bench. My face felt warm because it faced the hearth, but my back was cold where it touched the wall. That was normal in our house. One side of the body could feel hot, while the other remained cold. I pushed away the sheepskin and sat up. Runa slept beside me, pressed between Astrid and me. On my other side, my older brother Leif shifted beneath the sheepskin and pressed his cold feet against my legs. He had not been with us during the earlier, starving weeks. In a working Hålogaland longhouse, the younger men, Leif, Halvard, Ketil, Bjarni, and our two farmhands, usually spent the deep winter away at the coastal hunting camps, leaving my father alone to protect the main farm. But this storm was so violent, it had driven every single one of them back under our roof. During the day, the long wooden bench was where we sat, worked, ate, repaired tools, and prepared food. At night, it became our bed. We slept above the dirt floor because the coldest air remained close to the ground. Straw, moss, wool, and animal skins covered the bench beneath us. We usually kept most of our clothes on while sleeping. The house was warmer than the storm outside, but it was never warm enough to waste the heat trapped in our wool. The rest of the crowded household was beginning to stir. A cow shifted behind the wooden divider at the far end, and a goat knocked one horn against the boards. Our dog remained curled beneath the bench, unwilling to go near the door while the wind was so strong. Halvard was already sitting up near the wall, while Ketil and Bjarni began to stir on the opposite bench. With the men forced back from the coast, the house was completely full. Torstein and Astrid, Halvard and Leif, Runa, Irsa, the two farmhands, and I all lived under the same roof. There was no place to escape the smell. Smoke, wet wool, sweat, old straw, leather, fish, and animal dung mixed together in the air. I had known that smell all my life. I did not think of it as pleasant, but I thought of it as home. My mother was already kneeling beside the hearth. She moved the ash carefully with a thin stick. She did not try to start a completely new fire. That would have required more dry bark, more straw, and more time. Instead, she searched for the coals we had protected during the night. The hearth had been cut slightly below the floor and surrounded by stones. When the fire burned strongly, the stones absorbed part of its heat. After the flames weakened, they continued to release that heat into the room. The fire warmed us while it burned, but the stones helped the warmth last longer. Before sleeping, we gathered the remaining coals together and covered them with ash. The ash reduced the amount of air reaching them. This allowed the coals to burn slowly instead of disappearing during the night. My mother found a small red point under a black piece of charcoal. She placed dry bark beside it, added a few thin twigs, and blew gently. The red point grew brighter. A small flame appeared. Only then did she add a thicker piece of wood. A large log could keep a strong fire burning for a long time, but a weak coal could not easily light it. The fire had to grow in stages. First came the living coal, then the dry bark, then the smallest twigs, then thicker pieces of wood. If the order was wrong, the flame could die. My father watched me warming my hands. "Tonight, you will keep the fire," he said. At first, I thought I had heard him badly. My brother had kept it before. My parents had done it many times. I had only carried wood, removed ash, and watched other people work. "Me?" I asked. "You are old enough," he said. "You know what to do." I felt proud, but I also felt a tightness in my stomach. Keeping the fire did not mean adding as much wood as I wanted. Our supply was limited. If I fed the fire too heavily, we might use more fuel than we could replace. If I allowed the flames to rise too high, sparks could reach the roof. If I covered the coals with too much ash, they might lose all their air. If I left them uncovered, they might burn away before morning. The fire had to be controlled. We did not only create heat, we had to save it, guide it, and make it last. After our first meal, Leaf and I went outside to bring in more fuel. The door was built into the long side of the house rather than the narrow end, where the wind could strike more directly. It was low enough that even I had to bend when I passed through it. The smaller the opening, the less cold air entered whenever someone opened the door. The wind hit my face as soon as I stepped outside. Snow covered the roof and had gathered against the walls. From a distance, our home looked less like a tall wooden hall and more like a long mound rising from the ground. 2 rows of heavy posts inside carried much of the roof's weight. This allowed the outer walls to concentrate on blocking wind and slowing the loss of heat. Depending on the materials available, walls could be made from timber, woven branches covered with mud, clay, earth, or thick blocks of turf. Where good wood was difficult to find, thick turf walls were especially useful. Turf trapped small pockets of air, and those pockets slowed the movement of heat. The walls were heavy and often damp, but they kept the inside warmer than thin walls would have. Snow also helped. We cleared it when its weight became dangerous, but snow pressed against the walls could block the wind. A layer on the roof could slow the escape of heat. What felt cold in my hands could still help keep the house warm. When I was younger, I believed our home was low and dark because we could not build anything better. Once, I asked my father why we did not make more windows or raise the roof higher. He told me that a tall house full of openings might look impressive, but it would lose warmth quickly during a storm. Our home was long and low so the wind could pass over it. Its sides curved slightly. The roof was heavy. The walls were thick. The door was small. Almost every part of the building helped keep warmth from escaping. Standing outside that morning, I began to understand that the darkness was not simply a sign of poverty or poor building. The house had been shaped by winter. Comfort mattered less than keeping the people inside alive. My brother led me to the covered fuel store. We collected dry branches, bark, and small pieces of wood. Large logs were important, but the smaller pieces were just as necessary. A large log could keep a strong fire burning. It could not easily bring a dying coal back to life. Leaf made me separate the driest pieces from those that felt damp. Wet wood produced smoke, but it did not give useful heat quickly. During the night, when the fire was weak, the wrong piece of wood could waste the last heat in the hearth. We carried the driest bark and twigs separately. These were not scraps. They were what allowed a weak coal to become a flame. We stored them carefully because finding dry material during a winter storm could be difficult. I was not old enough to do every adult task, but I was old enough to help. I gathered fuel, carried water, fed the sheep, cleaned fish, watched my sister, and repaired simple objects. Children learned by watching first, then helping, and finally taking responsibility for work of their own. When we carried the wood back inside, smoke struck my throat and made me cough. The wind had changed direction. Instead of rising through the opening in the roof, the smoke rolled beneath the rafters and began to sink toward the benches. Bjarni used a long pole to open the smoke hole wider. The air improved for a moment. Then cold moved down from the roof and across the room. Astrid told him to close the opening part way. This was a problem without a perfect solution. If the smoke hole was too small, smoke gathered beneath the roof and moved down into the space where we breathed. If it was opened too widely, warm air escaped. Strong wind could also push cold air back through the opening. I hated the smoke. It clung to my hair, my skin, and my clothing. It darkened the roof beams and made our eyes water. Yet smoke also helped dry the fish and meat hanging above the hearth. It kept the upper timbers drier, and soot discouraged some insects. None of that made the smoke harmless. It meant only that we had to choose between different dangers. We could open the roof wider and lose more warmth, or close it and breathe more smoke. We could burn more fuel and feel warmer, or use less so that the wood would last longer. Until then, I had thought the adults simply accepted the smoke because they had no better idea. I began to understand that they were constantly measuring one risk against another. The animals at the far end of the house reminded me of my next task. I carried hay to the sheep, checked the water, and helped remove dirty straw and dung. A wooden divider separated the animals from our sleeping and working area, but it was not completely sealed. The smell was strong, and I complained. My grandmother pointed toward the cows. "You complain about their smell?" she said, "but you use their warmth." A cow released heat day and night. Several animals could make one end of the house less cold. Keeping them indoors also protected them from wind, snow, and predators. If an important animal died during winter, the household lost much more than a single meal. Cows gave milk. Milk could become butter, cheese, or skyr, which lasted longer than fresh milk. Sheep gave wool for clothing, blankets, and sacks. Hides could become leather. Bones and horns could become handles, needles, pins, cups, and other useful objects. Animals also provided meat, but we could not kill them whenever we felt hungry. If we slaughtered too many before spring, we would lose milk, wool, young animals, and future food. A living animal could continue to feed and clothe the household. A dead one could not. Older animals might be chosen for slaughter before younger ones, because the young could still grow and breed. Hunger made us think about the present, but keeping the herd alive required us to think about the following year. Until that morning, I had mostly noticed the noise, the dirt, and the extra work the animals created. Now I understood that they were part of the house's warmth, food supply, clothing, tools, and future. After I finished with the animals, I crossed to the loom where my mother and grandmother were working. Wool did not become clothing by itself. It had to be cleaned, combed, pulled into fibers, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. The threads hung from an upright loom and were held tight by heavy stones. I helped move some wool and passed tools to my grandmother. The work was slow. A small amount of finished cloth required many hours of preparation. That cloth became tunics, cloaks, blankets, and sacks. The fire could warm the air inside the house, but clothing kept warmth close to the body. Outside, thick wool protected us from wind and snow. At night, wool blankets and animal skins helped us keep the heat our bodies produced. Wet clothing had to be dried near the hearth, but not so close that sparks could reach it. A person who went outside in damp wool could become dangerously cold. Even clothing had to be managed as carefully as food and fuel. The Longhouse was also where we prepared and stored almost everything we needed. Benches served as seats, beds, and work surfaces. Chests held clothing and tools but could also be used as stools. The table could be moved aside when we needed more floor space. Wood and iron required time and labor to obtain. Space inside the house was limited. An object that served several purposes was more useful than one that did only a single job. By midday, my stomach hurt, but we did not stop for another full meal. We usually ate 2 main meals each day. Between them, there might be a small piece of dried fish, bread, fruit, or nuts, depending on what remained. Most winter food had been prepared before the coldest weather arrived. Fish and meat could be dried, smoked, or salted. Milk became butter, cheese, or skyr, because these lasted longer than fresh milk. Grain was stored dry and later made into porridge or rough bread. Some foods could also be kept in sour whey, which slowed them from spoiling. Barley, rye, and oats were important because they could grow in colder conditions. Grain lasted longer than fresh meat and could feed many people. Losing a grain store to dampness, animals, or rot could threaten the entire household. For the evening meal, my mother put dried fish, grain, onion, and a little mutton into one pot. She cooked the meat with its bones so that little was wasted. The broth carried fat and flavor through the whole pot, allowing a small amount of meat to be shared among many bowls. I used to look at my portion and think only about whether it was large enough. That day, I began to understand that every bowl depended on the amount of food still needed for the rest of winter. Eating more today could mean having less several weeks later. The storm became stronger before sunset. Wind pressed against the roof and found every small gap around the door. Before darkness fully closed around the house, everyone checked their work again. Leif and I brought in another armful of dry wood. Yrsa made sure the animals had enough hay and water. Astrid covered the remaining food and moved our damp clothing close enough to the hearth to dry. Halvard and Kettle checked the door and the roof supports together. Bjarni cleared the loose straw away from the fire. Each task seemed small, but leaving one unfinished could cause trouble during the night. A strong household did not survive because one person knew everything. It survived because everyone completed a part of the work. After the evening meal, we moved the table aside and prepared the benches for sleeping. My father drew the coals together and covered most of them with ash. Then he showed me again what I would have to do. "Do not remove all the ash," he said. "Find the red beneath the black. Give it dry bark first, then small twigs. Blow slowly. A large log comes later. Too much air could make the coal burn away. Too little could kill it. Wet wood would create smoke without enough heat. A heavy log placed too early could smother a weak flame. A fire that grew too quickly could send sparks toward the roof. Keeping the hearth alive was not one simple task. It depended on the fuel being dry, the smoke opening being controlled, the ash being left in place, and the fire being fed in the correct order. I sat beside the hearth for a long time. I listened to the animals, the breathing of my family, and the wind pushing against the roof. The flames became smaller, as they should. I checked the coals, moved one piece of wood, and watched the red light beneath the ash. At last, I returned to the bench. I told myself I would sleep lightly. I listened for the sound of burning wood. I counted breaths. I watched the weak red glow through half-closed eyes. Then the sounds became distant. When my sister's shaking woke me, the fire had disappeared beneath the ash. I crossed the floor and found the faint red coal I had seen in the darkness. For a moment, I wanted to wake my father. He had told me to call him if I was uncertain. Instead, I placed dry bark beside the coal and added a few thin fibers. Then I blew. Ash rose into my face, and I coughed. The red point became darker. I panicked and blew harder. Smoke appeared, but there was no flame. For a moment, I believed I had destroyed the last living heat in the hearth. My hands shook. I looked toward my father, but he was still asleep. Then I remembered my mother working that morning. She had not rushed. She had not scraped away all the ash or forced the fire to grow. She had given the coal what it needed, little by little. I moved the bark and left a small space for air. I placed the driest twigs around it. Then I bent close and blew slowly. The red point became brighter. I stopped and waited. Then I blew again. A thin line of smoke rose from the bark. Its edge turned black. A small yellow flame appeared, bent to one side, and almost vanished. I protected it with my hand and added one small twig. I waited until the flame took hold. Then I added another twig. Only after both were burning did I place a thicker piece of wood across them. I did not open the smoke hole widely. The smoke became worse for a while, but opening the roof too far would have allowed more heat to escape. I accepted the smoke and watched the flame carefully. When the larger wood began to burn, warmth slowly returned. The stones around the hearth began to absorb heat again. My sister stopped shaking. The animals became quieter. No one else woke. No one saw how close the fire had come to dying. I remained beside the hearth until the smoke hole changed from black to gray, and I knew morning was near. My father woke first. He looked at me, then at the fire, and finally at the ash I had moved. He understood what had happened. I expected him to be angry because I had fallen asleep. Instead, he placed another dry piece of wood in my hands and gave me a small nod. That was all, but I knew what it meant. Before that day, I had mostly noticed what made our house difficult to live in. It was dark, crowded, smoky, and full of work. By morning, I understood that these things were connected. The house held the warmth, the animals and wool helped us keep it, and the food and fuel had been saved for the coldest days. None of it worked without people doing their part. That night, my part had been to protect one small coal until it became a fire again. The hearth was warm, the stones were heating, and my sister was no longer shaking. I was still only a boy, but I finally understood our longhouse. It had not been built to be bright or comfortable. It had been built to carry all of us through winter. Keeping the fire alive meant keeping that entire system alive until morning.